November and December are an interesting time of year. Around the holidays, it's a lot of fun, a lot of tradition, a lot of time with family, but there's also a lot of waiting to be done. Maybe you're just anticipating, waiting anxiously to get a break from school. You want some time off. Or maybe you're really looking forward to traveling. I know a lot of times, especially kids, they get really excited about waiting to open their presents on Christmas morning. And it's tough to wait when you have something in store that you're looking forward to. It can be really difficult to wait. But it's easier to wait when you know that there's an end in sight, that there's a plan in place and you know what's going to happen. So it may be tough in some ways to wait, but knowing that good things are in store makes it a little easier to wait. But what do you do when things don't go according to plan? Or what do you do when you don't know the plan, or you're not even sure if there is a plan? Does it stress you out? Does it make you angry? Does it give you a ton of anxiety? Most of us know the Christmas story. We know about the birth of Jesus, born in a manger, Mary and Joseph. But sometimes we lose sight of the fact that God started planning long before the Christmas Day story began. Long before Jesus was born in a manger, God had a plan. The book of Genesis opens up with some poetic versions of the origin of people, where we came from. And it tells us that God created a good world and had a good relationship with the first people. But we're told pretty early on that a serpent comes into the scene and convinces these first people that they need to reject God and make their own decisions. And then it tells us in Genesis chapter 3, there's some consequences for their making the decision to go their own way to listen to the serpent. And some of these consequences are given to the people, to the man and the woman, Adam and Eve. But some of the consequences are broader than that. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, it says this: I will put enmity, which is conflict or hostility, between you, talking to the serpent, and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. In other words, in a future time, the descendants of these first people are going to lash out in some way and strike a blow, a devastating blow, to this evil that's come into the world. So here in Genesis chapter 3, we see that when it seems like God's plan is failing, we can finally get our first glimpse that God has a plan. Now, it's kind of cryptic and it's hard to understand. And if you just were reading this by itself, you may not even realize that God's telling you he has a plan, but God has a bigger plan. Fast forward to King David. In the Old Testament, we read about King David, and we're told that King David was promised that his family would have an important role to play in this plan that God was unfolding. Fast forward even farther to the prophets. There's a prophet named Jeremiah, and he's writing to a people who are oppressed, broken down. They've experienced poverty and displacement, and they're probably thinking that all hope is lost. And they're wondering, does God have a plan? Is God even listening, or does God even care? And this is what Jeremiah wrote in Jeremiah 33, starting in verse 14. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will fulfill the promise I made to the house of Israel and to the house of Judah. In those days and at that time, I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In those days, Judah will be saved and Jerusalem will dwell securely. And this is the name by which it will be called: the Lord is our righteousness. It refers there in Jeremiah 33 to a righteous branch. And you should think of this as like a family tree, that God is going to take David's family tree, his family line, and fulfill the promise. So we go from Adam and Eve to King David all the way to this future king that God was going to use to save the world. And all throughout the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, there are these hints, these pictures, these references and clues that tell us that God has a plan. God had good things in store and that better days were on their way. If you go to the New Testament of the Bible, the part of the Bible that tells stories about Jesus and the early church, and we see in Matthew chapter 1, which is a biography of Jesus, and Luke chapter 3, which is another biography of Jesus, that Jesus has a family tree, a place he comes from. And if you read through this family tree, you see all kinds of people. You see kings, peasants, rich, poor, religious people, not so religious people, men, women. They all had a role to play in God's plan of bringing Jesus into the world. God's plan unfolded over generations, and everybody had a role to play. What that tells us when we see these stories, even though they may be kind of boring to read through like genealogies and family trees, is it's really showing us that God can be trusted, that even when people have to wait, God is still working his plan. Because today, as always, God has a plan for us. So what should you do when you're feeling anxious because things aren't going the way you expected, or when the future seems really uncertain, or when you're just overwhelmed by life? What should you do? Well, here's what you should do. You should stop. Be intentional about taking some time off, resting, and slowing down. You should take a deep breath. Really mind your breathing and be present in the moment. And you should have a conversation with God. Because even when we don't see it, and even when we have to wait, we can trust that God has a plan.